Okay. All right. So we are going to wrap up microbiology with fungi or fungi. And I'm going to spare you the fun guy jokes. I've used them in the past and they don't go over that as well as I would like. Okay. So fungal pathogens, they can be true or primary fungal pathogens. Okay. And those are the types that can grow in non-immunocompromised hosts. Okay. So, not to be confused with opportunistic fungal pathogens. The true or primary ones can get any of us. Um, some of them are morphologically, meaning based on their shape, or physiologically, based on things like their temperature, or the oxygen content in the environment, are able to grow either on or in our body. So we have fungal infections that are on the surface of our skin. We can have fungal infections that are internal. And the type of fungi that does that infection is going to be, it's going to be based on the tolerances of that particular species. Okay. We talked about we talked about dimorphic fungi, right? How it can be either a hyphae type multicellular filament, or it can be a single cellular yeast um, morphology. So it can go either way based on the environment that it's in. And so some fungi can switch between the two. It can be more mold-like with the hyphal cells, the long filaments, or it can be more yeast-like depending on the temperature. Okay, so at room temperature or a little bit higher, around 30 degrees Celsius, they tend to be molds, right? So this is what we see on our bread if it's been out too long, or on a produce if it's hung around sufficiently long enough. The fuzzy stuff, right? But what happens is if that enters the body, it can then at 37 degrees body temperature have this dimorphism, meaning, two body shapes, and it becomes a yeast. And so this is just a scheme to outline that, right? So in a natural habitat, in, just in the environment, hanging out, it's going to be this fuzzy hyphae. Um, Once it enters in the body via a spore, right? Because the hyphal cells will then bud off these spores for reproduction. If those spores enter the body via inhalation or through a cut, a compromise of your barrier, then rather than grow into hyphal filaments, they exist as single-celled yeast that will then bud off. Okay. And then those will have spores that were released. And if they exit the host and go back into a more room temperature environment, then they will be hyphae again. Okay. So really amazing adaptability of fungi to be completely different in their morphology based on things like temperature. Opportunistic fungal pathogens um, typically are not infectious. They don't have a lot of virulence factors. What they have is an ability to reproduce and grow and thrive in host defenses that are impaired, so immunocompromised people. Okay. So that's the difference between um, the true primary fungal pathogens and the opportunistic pathogens. It's all about the host. Um, Some of this is superficial, meaning, on the skin, discomforting, but not life threatening. Some can be in the middle where it's debilitating, but not life threatening. But in some cases, it can become systemic. And as we've talked about all quarter, when microbes become systemic, that signals a life threatening event, right? When it's localized, it can be dealt with from the own host's immune responses and through medical intervention. But systemic infection, if not effectively, quickly treated, can lead to death. This becomes more and more of a concern nowadays in hospital settings. So think of the nosocomial infections, right? Infections that are acquired in the hospital. 10% come from fungal pathogens. And oftentimes, as I've said, AIDS patients are hospitalized, and in the hospital, they end up acquiring some kind of other pathogen besides HIV that takes them out. And, fungal pathogens is an example of that. Dermatophytes, we've mentioned them previously. They are fungi that have the ability to transform over time into true pathogens and then invade and infect hosts that are not immunocompromised. How does the pathogenesis occur? Well, as we talked about at the beginning of this quarter, there has to be a portal of entry. Okay. Again, typically that's through the respiratory tract. You breathe it in. Okay. However, that can happen also if you have some kind of cut on your skin, right? That now opens up that barrier. Finally, you can have cutaneous superficial pathogenesis, which is the fungi infecting the epidermal cells that make up your skin. Some of them have virulence factors. So not the opportunistic, but the true primary fungi are going to have things like thermal dimorphism, right? The ability to change their structure and their tolerance and their lifestyle based on whether or not they're outside or inside the host. Some will secrete toxins or form capsules to hang out. Adhesion factors, remember those? That's for attachment. Hydrolytic enzymes to then break down the tissue and enter further inside the host. And then inflammatory stimulants. Okay, these are some examples of the virulence factors that fungi have. The host defenses are going to be primarily your skin, right? If it's not a fungus that infects the outside of your skin, then having intact skin is your best bet. The mucosal membranes of your nose and respiratory tract, because most of the fungi are inhaled, are going to do a great job. The cilia are these wavy, fingery projections that really kind of anything comes down, and before it gets into your lungs, the cilia kind of wave it and flutter it back out of your system. And you can either swallow it and then digest and break it down that way, or expel it back out. There is some, of course, immune cell related responses as well. So phagocytosis. And again, there are ways that microbes get around phagocytosis and in fact use phagocytosis as a way to protect themselves. So it works in some cases, but not all cases. We don't really have immunization for fungal infections. Okay. There's not really a prophylactic approach to prevent fungal infections for the most part. There are a few for the coccidioidomycosis and histoplasmosis that we'll talk about next or coming up, but not widely used, not prophylactically used very often. I think if you're traveling to certain tropical regions, you might this might be in a vaccine regimen that you get, but very, very rare. So if you wear masks, then that's a great way to prevent inhalation. And as we are all now primed for this mask wearing world, maybe as a consequence, we will get less fungal infections. If it does get bad to the point where the body can't take care of it, then there will have to be surgical intervention to remove damaged and infected tissue, typically, and that's going to be stuff on the outside. Just kind of a review here. The true pathogens are going to be the ones that don't need any kind of compromised immune system, and they can range from being cutaneous, superficial, to being systemic. And so, going beyond the skin barrier into the realm of where it hits the bloodstream. Once it hits the bloodstream, then it's systemic. Opportunistic infections are going to be those that just happen to be in a host that is not able to use its immune system to keep it at bay. There are 4 different categories, because remember, scientists like to put things into little categorical boxes, right? And so 4 major types: the histoplasma, the blastomyces, the coccidioides, and the paracoccidioides. And this is looking at their distribution. And as you see, it's primarily in the Americas and in Africa. Okay. And certain fungal types are going to be more prevalent in some areas versus other areas. And it doesn't mean that these fungal pathogens aren't present in Europe or in Asia, but it's just focusing on this geographical segment and highlighting it, because that's kind of what we'll be talking about in this chapter. But don't think that that's just restricted to these 3 continents. Let's start with histoplasmosis, or also known as Ohio Valley fever. This is really the main true pathogen that we see in the US. And it's a dimorphic pathogen. So again, outside the host, it's a hyphae or a mold. That mold spore gets inhaled because you're breathing in just the dust, and the stuff is present in the soil. And so as a result, you inhale the spores, and then they go on to be having a yeast morphology. They infect your respiratory system. And they're conidia. So if you remember the lab, the virtual on-campus lab where we talked about the different types of morphology and the sexual reproduction, the conidia are, let's see, I'm going to try to draw. They're the ones that look kind of like, I don't know, like maybe like broccoli, or they're bunched. So you have, when they're outside the body, you have these conidiophores, right? And then all the conidia, these chain. Why isn't it let me draw? You have these chains of conidia, which are the spores. Okay. Oh, yeah. It doesn't like, apparently Zoom doesn't like my drawing either, because it keeps trying to keep me from doing that. So Okay. But anyway, um, so this is really what a lot of patients with fungal infections will present with. It's a pretty common one of the true pathogens, meaning is fair game for anyone. Um, so the ways of contracting, again, you have oftentimes birds can pass it through their feces, or just by digging around on the looking for worms and then flying away. And then as they flap their wings and stuff, they rain down the soil that they were digging around in or encountering. And in that soil, you have the spores, and then now it's aerosolized. And so you have this person here. He looks like he's maybe going for a run or something, and he breathes it in, and it gets engulfed by the phagocyte. But look, it says, you know what? That's not going to kill me. In fact, that phagocyte is just going to give me a nice little sac to reproduce and make more and more yeast cells. And then I'm going to rupture that phagocyte, and I'm going to release myself and go into the internal organs and cause systemic infection and take out the host. And then when the host goes, it will release my spores, and I'll go on and do whatever. I'll do my thing. Coccidioidomycosis is not Ohio valley fever, but just valley fever. And it is going to present with these lesions here on the skin, and quite uncomfortable, quite unsightly lesions. Hopefully you guys have already eaten lunch and aren't planning to eat during this lecture, because we'll have pictures that aren't particularly appetite inducing. Outside the body, it exists as an arthroconidia. Okay, so this structure here of hyphae, but then um, hyphal cells that aren't quite connected all the way firmly. So it's not a complete. It's like in a way, like a pseudo hyphae. Um, and then this can be either on the skin, or it can be inhaled from dust particles, enter the lungs, and cause fungomas, nodules in the lungs. Okay. And as you could imagine, that's going to lead to a chronic disease of the lungs. Okay. It's really hard to reverse those fungomas once they've formed. Beyond that, it can go into bone and cause infection of the bone, which then is going to also, become systemic, because your blood vessels entering the bone, also disrupting the bone marrow, disrupting your immune cells. And so it can be pretty bad, right? And if eventually going on to the central nervous system. So a very invasive fungal pathogen potentially. Here are the arthrospores. So again, you see this conidia, these hyphae that are branched, but then they start to kind of disconnect from each other and form these separate spores that then get inhaled, and as I mentioned, can reach the bone and go on from there to wreak havoc on the body. Blastomyces, also dimorphic, free living in the soil as the previous fungi we've talked about. And it takes about anywhere from 10 to 100 conidia or spores to manifest in disease. Now, these spores are small, 10 isn't that much. It's pretty easy to inhale that many. And so once that happens, it gets into the lungs, where it exists now as a yeast, because again, it's dimorphic, mold on the outside, The mold isn't what really infects you, it's the spores in the mold. Okay, so let's make that distinction, make sure we understand that. Which does that mean that you should breathe in mold? It's okay? No, because the mold has spores, right? But it's really the spore from that mold that then goes on to become yeast. It's not that a mold can change its mold-like self into a yeast. It's that the mold, the mold's progeny can become yeast. Symptoms, because it infects the lungs, is going to be cough, right? When your lungs are infected with something, it's a natural reaction to cough, right? It's one of those lines of defenses. And as with most infections, you will get a fever that will rise up and try and kill. It doesn't just have to be isolated to the lungs, however. There's also cutaneous infection, as you see this lesion here on the skin of this patient. It can go to the bone and the CNS, okay? And this is just looking at it under the microscope, stained with, I think that's probably methylene blue. And then this image is fluorescent stain, um, showing the morphology. Paracoccidioidomycosis is a mouthful, and it's also a dimorphic fungal pathogen. This is going to be one that's more in Central and South America, the ones we've talked about previously, Ohio valley fever, those are going to be more predominant in the US. These also cause lung infections because of inhalation. Luckily, systemic disease doesn't manifest as commonly as some of these other ones. That said, it can happen. It can also infect the skin. It can go into the lymph nodes and infect the lymph nodes. And now, remember, the lymph is where all of your immune cells are circulating. And so, what that does is that will wreak havoc on your lymphatic system, which then leads to, subsequent infection susceptibility. The subcutaneous fungi, or intermediate virulence. So these are the ones that aren't just going to be on the surface of your skin, but probably um, aren't going to become systemic. They're not going to infect your central nervous system. And the reason that is because they are not as tolerant to higher temperatures. Okay. So your body's internal temperature is not permissive for these fungi to take hold, which is why they just enter subcutaneously, just under that layer of skin, but can't penetrate deep into your more higher thermal temperatures. And so some of these categories are going to be sporotrichosis, chromoblastomycosis, phaeohyphomycosis, and mycetoma. Okay. These are the major ones, the major flavors of intermediate mycoses. Do you need to know all four of these? No, but would it be good to know examples of a true primary fungal pathogen, an opportunistic pathogen, and one that's kind of in the middle? Certainly that would be good for you to know that. Rose Gardner's disease looks terrible. It's a saprobe. Okay, so saprobes, remember, they're saprophytic or saprophytes. They secrete enzymes that digest dead organic matter and then extract the nutrients from that matter, typically in the soil or in rotting, decomposed detritus. And this Rose Gardner's disease, or sporotrichosis, is going to leave this really terrible looking, very unpleasant to experience rash on your skin. And so usually is found on the arms and legs, your limbs, but can also go into the lungs. It's lymphocutaneous, meaning it can penetrate the skin and then spread to the lymph nodes. So once it spreads to the lymph nodes, now we have a bigger problem, right? Because again, your lymphatic system is important for immune regulation. Chromoblastomycosis, also a very, very gnarly rash on your skin. And even more so, it can cause a terrible disfigurement and can be a vast impediment to getting around. So you have these things called verrucous lesions, just these large plaques that have basically destroyed your epithelium. And um, so you get these sclerotic or scar tissued cells that just form this giant wound on the outside of your appendage. And so this would be something, um, as an example, something that would have to be surgically removed, if removed at all. You can imagine once it gets to some of these pictures on the right, where it's taken over the entire limb, that whole left leg, you can't really remove all of that. That would be too big of a wound. That would then make that patient susceptible to all kinds of other pathogens, right? And so this is debilitating, right? I mean, it may not kill you, but that's going to impact your quality of life and your ability to be mobile significantly. Phaeohyphomycosis is going to be um, a fungi that is typically hyphal. Okay. So that means it's not often a dimorphic fungus that can be inhaled and turned into a yeast. It's going to um, grow as a mold like morphology on the skin and look like, oh, it almost looks like moss or like bark. It looks, because it is still hyphal in its morphology, it looks very like this crusty, very plant-like plaque. And as you can imagine, back many, 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 many years ago, before we even knew what microbes were, this was, very alarming and very freakish in nature, and people thought that they were turning into trees, and so there were, you know, lots of mistreatment for people who suffered from this. It can go subcutaneously, and when it does, it forms these cysts, as you see in this lower right-hand panel, this big nodule under the skin that then has to be surgically removed. Kind of walls itself off, so the body cannot take care of it. Meaning take care of it, like take it out. And so if you're immunocompromised and you're at this point, that can lead to further spread into the lungs, the bones, the CNS. And so either any way you have this, it's quite debilitating, potentially lethal in immunocompromised patients. A mycetoma, okay, that's going to be walking barefoot, right? Potentially. So you walk around and you have these fungi in the soil, and they implant into the skin and the bottom of your foot, and it leads to this ever developing and expanding progressive hand or foot disease. Things that come into contact with the soil. And if you have any kind of cut or pinprick or anything, and that just gives it this license to take over, and it forms almost like these tumor-like growths on the outside of your hand and feet. Ringworm. We were talking about ringworm the other day. There was a question about ringworm and whether or not that was a helminth, but no, it is a fungus, and there are different types depending on where they are most prevalent. So, Tinea capitis is going to be ringworm of the scalp. So, on the top panel, you see this, it looks like a bald spot, but it's really a bald spot where this fungus is destroying the epithelia and damaging the hair follicles. And so there can also be tinea barbae, which is going to be barbae is, I guess, Latin for barber, right? And it's going to be on the face. And oftentimes it's called ringworm of the beard because guys like me who have beards, it can trap those fungal spores and give them a nice place to take hold. Luckily, I've never had an issue with ringworm of the beard. Knock on wood, right? But there's also a ringworm of the body that is called tinea corporis. Okay, and that can then just be that's where we think of typical ringworm occurring, and it's going to be a circular um, lesion, or just like even just like a circular demarcation on the skin. There's ringworm of the groin, which we call colloquially jock itch. There's ringworm of the nails, which is going to be just, toenail fungus and fingernail fungus. It just, if you see people who have the yellowish kind of hardened, thickened nails, it's because of ringworm, a particular type. Very hard to treat because it's underneath that fingernail bed. Ringworm of the foot, tinea pedis, or hand, tinea manuum, is going to be again, not under the nails, but on the skin. Okay. And so all these different varieties of ringworm, it's not just one type of ringworm. It's based on each of these have their own little habitats that they prefer. And there's localized patterns. Okay. Superficial mycoses. So it's going to actually cause discoloration of the skin in the terms of tinea versicolor. So, I think there's another word for this called holly rot. I think that's what they call it in Hawaii, um, where you get this discoloration in your skin, and it's a fungal infection. I think it's called holly rot. But can also come about if you have other skin diseases like psoriasis, that can, because the epithelium is compromised already, it can lead to infiltration of these fungi. So again, a few different examples of superficial fungi, meaning it doesn't penetrate into the body. Black Piedra is going to be a fungus that actually lives on your hair. So this bottom picture is a hair follicle, and it's going to have this little nodule that it forms around that hair. I don't know really if how visible that is, but certainly is not going to lead to a nice flowy mane of nice hair. So not these are not nearly as bad as the other pictures that we've just looked at, but still nonetheless are not necessarily pleasant or benign. Any questions on that, guys? No? Okay. Um, so secondary opportunistic mycoses. So not the true primary, these are secondary opportunistic. So that means there has to be some kind of predisposition to allow this to happen. Typically immunocompromisation. Okay. And so Candida is going to be one that's quite prevalent in immunocompromised people. Aspergillus is going to be aspergillosis in the lungs. And then Cryptococcus is a pathogen, a fungal pathogen that often will take out patients with AIDS. That will be what leads to their demise. And then these other ones, so rhizopus is typically the kind of molds that you see on bread and stuff. So often not an issue for the vast majority of human hosts. But if you do have some kind of immunocompromisation, or you have some other disease that forces you to become immunocompromised, right? Whether you're taking whether you're having chemotherapy that is just indiscriminately wiping out your immune cells, or you have an autoimmune disorder, you need to take medicines to tame your immune system, then it opens up the possibility for these secondary opportunistic infections to come and take hold. Candida albicans, as you guys know, is not fermenting. And you don't have to worry about so I did send you home with some Candida albicans, but it's a pretty non-pathogenic strain that we acquire from a vendor. Okay, so I don't want any of you to be freaking out. Oh my gosh, he's lecturing about these secondary opportunistic yeast and he's subjecting us to it. You should be fine. I mean, I'm assuming you didn't drink the leftover Candida albicans in the tube. Short-lived, usually superficial, can lead to systemic infection in some cases, but is not a very common threat. The cells can turn into pseudohyphae or true hyphae. And you remember pseudohyphae is yeast cells that don't properly separate completely after they bud off. And so you have these chains of yeast cells that are kind of like hyphae. And so eventually that's going to form a colony that's going to be whitish in color and kind of have that yeasty smell to it. It can be in all kinds of different regions. So it can be in the genital tract, it can be on your skin, it can take residence in burn patients where their epithelial cells have been damaged, and can be on the tongue. It can cause thrush. Primarily, thrush is something that younger kids and infants deal with. And is a large percentage of the nosocomial fungal infections that we see in the hospital. So we said that 10% of fungal, I said 10% of fungal infections, 10% of nosocomial infections are fungal in origin, and of those 70%. So anyway, where did my screen go? Uh-oh. Maybe you guys can see it not there. Okay. All right. So immunocompromised people, this can be an issue. aspergillosis, airborne soil fungus, many different species. However, only 8 are really primarily involved in human pathogenesis. Um, Seriously threatening to AIDS patients as well. Here, this is a much better image of a Canidia chain and a Canidia than what I was trying to draw earlier. This is Canidia, if you guys remember. Can also be involved in that can lead to allergies or exacerbate allergies. If you have a house that has mold in it, this can be inhaled and wreak havoc on your sinuses. It can inhabit the eyelids, canals, or the ear canals. If it's inhaled, it can enter into the lungs and form what's called a necrotic pneumonia, where it actually just tears apart your lung cells. Can go to the brain, the heart, other organs. So very bad, right? Very bad for immunocompromised people. Okay, but for the most part, we are fortunate that we don't have to, those of us that aren't immunocompromised, this is not an issue. Cryptococcus, look at that. So that is infection of oftentimes the skin on the outside. Again, as I said, common in patients with AIDS, can also impact cancer patients that are immunocompromised, diabetic patients. Not only is it a skin infection, but it can also go into the lungs, forming nodules, go from there and disseminate into the meninges of the brain. And that is very, very bad news. Okay. So, you know, that's why I didn't really like fungus until recently. I don't like it because of this, but like in my mind, I'm like, here is a microbe that doesn't need to do this stuff, right? I mean, some bacteria, they're obligate, strict parasites. They have no other way to survive. Not that I'm condoning their behavior, but like it's that or nothing. But with these fungus, they're perfectly okay existing outside in the soil, right? But then this happens, right? So they're kind of the pardon my French, but they're kind of the bastards of the microbes in that they do this to people and animals, right? And so um it really is something that most of us don't have to worry about, but those that do have to worry about it, it's a major concern. Zygomycosis, that's from the zygosporangial flavors of fungi. They are going to be saprobes in the soil, and they get into the water, and they get into our food. And typically, this is going to be rhizopus, so the black bread mold. Often they're pretty much harmless, right? If you ate some moldy bread, it's not really going to make you sick, pretty much, if you're healthy. But it can get into, certain portals of entry like your eyes, your nose, and from there it can get systemic. And if you are diabetic, immunocompromised, you don't have a good source of nutrition, and so therefore your body physiologically isn't primed to feed the immune cells that are responsible for keeping all of these ubiquitous microbes at bay, then it can become bad. And that's it, guys. The last lecture, I know that was fast. I kind of want to just get through it. Any questions on this? I know I did it like, kind of fast, but like in terms of what do you need to know about these things, just some very basic examples. So just know the difference between true primary fungal infections and secondary opportunistic fungal infections. Be familiar with those 4 different types. You don't need to, I'm not going to give you an image and say, well, which one is this? You know, like it's going to be just real basic because this is right before the final. Okay. And we can go over this some more on Monday. But unless there are any other questions, you guys are free to go.
So, Doc, if somebody calls me a fun guy, it could mean on a deeper level that I'm a bastard of all microbes. What an insult.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. Taken out of context, you know, or maybe that's your inside joke. You can say, oh yeah, that's a real fun guy over there. And you know, just between you and your wife, that guy's a total loser. Yeah. I just thought of that. Maybe I might use that. I might have to tell my wife about that. That'll be our little our euphemism.
Yeah, my 9-year-old let me know that honey actually is bee vomit. So when I call my wife honey, I'm actually calling her bee vomit.
See, we call that biohumor, right? Stuff that, you know, stuff that nerds find amusing. So yeah, bee vomit. Well, who knew that bee vomit could taste so good?
I have to always laugh when I hear about the group called Parasites Without Borders.
No, I haven't heard of that one. That's interesting.
No.
Parasite
Yeah.
Without Borders.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's intense.
Right? Yeah.
And so the ringworm, you might call ringworm parasites with borders, depending on if it's the scalp or if it's the, you know, the feet or the nail bed and whatnot. Okay. Well, cool. I will see you guys. Yes. Are we getting a study guide for the final exam? Yes, it's all done. I was just waiting to see if I had time to get this lecture in. And so you're welcome. Now I can add the fungi of medical relevance to the study guide, and I will post it after this lecture today. So it'll be up very shortly. Any other questions? Okay. Well, again, thank you guys for traveling down this road of microbiology with me in this platform. And I will see some of you, all of you, on Monday for the review. It's not mandatory, it's optional. So if I don't see you then, best of luck on the final. Best of luck finishing up this class and your other classes if you have them. And it's been a real pleasure. So take care, and we'll see you. The review is Monday at 10, so same time as lecture time.
Oh, Professor, sorry.
Yeah.
Just one quick question.
Yeah.
So do you have the hypothesis or industrial micro in the exam or not? Like the whole week with all of the application. So do we have that one in the exam or not?
Are you talking about the applied microbiology?
Yeah. The whole week, it doesn't have anything about the real microbial, but just like the application or hypothesis.
Yeah, I'm not really, that's not really going to be on the test. I don't, yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
And the microbiome stuff, you know, that kind of stuff, that was really just me getting off on a tangent. So I'm not going to hold you to that either. So you look out for that study guide, and it'll have everything that you know. And if you know everything on that study guide, you will be just fine.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all.
See you Monday. Yeah.
See you guys Monday. Have a great weekend.